Thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be here and to be joined by all of you all, actually, many friends I see along the way, as well as our distinguished discussants. I want to talk about the book North, the Future of Post-Climate America. And I'm just going to pull this out here. Everybody can hear me okay, I hope. All right, so North, Oxford University Press. And the general thesis of this book is that climate change is fundamentally, currently, present and future tense, is altering how and where Americans will live. And we can think that in this context, there's a new geography of risk and opportunity. And this is how we can ground ourselves, at least spatially. In this context, we can think that there's a kind of macro, intermediate, and micro way to sort of break this book down. And in fact, it's a book on adaptation science for the most part, for the scholars in the room that can appreciate on one fundamental ambition is to bring some epistemological order to adaptation science. But for everyone else, we can think that climate change is going to alter our standard of living and our way of life. At an intermediate scale, it's going to change and is already altering human mobility and the decisions in it shaping, of course, the decisions of how and where we're going to live. And then on a micro sort of level, it speaks to all of the mechanisms and ways of how we cope with not just climate change, but global change more broadly. So we can think in terms of human mobility that there's mechanisms of push and pull. We can sort of simplify it in those terms. And so we can think initially about push. What does that push factor look like? Well, push, we can understand physical risk exposure. We've got floods, fires, droughts, and the things and circumstances from which people lose their homes and their livelihoods. And that's clear enough in terms of its originating logic. We also have transition risk exposure and the extent to which transitioning and decarbonizing economies alter our ability to, sustain ourselves. And certainly, let's say, coal miners in Kentucky or whatever it may be. We also have chronic economic stresses. And in this context, climate is interacting with a broad range of stresses that speak to an allied set of considerations around affordability, if you will. So we can think about a tax base, utility bills, car insurance, all of these things that speak to the cost of living and the relative affordability of wherever we live. And climate is shaping and interacting with all of these broader chronic economic stresses. And finally, we have, as a push factor, declines in human health. In fact, we could have a whole lecture and spend the whole rest of the evening just talking about the public health implications of climate change. People go on vacation in Florida and they pick up dengue and cholera on the way. You may not even be aware of that. So there's also pull factors. So for as much as there's push, and that's well documented empirically, there's also pull factors from which we're getting a better understanding in terms of consumer preferences, among other things. So people are looking for reduced vulnerability. They're looking to reduce their economic costs, particularly if you're a coastal homeowner in Florida and you're trying to reduce your insurance costs, for instance. They're looking for more moderate ambient weather. And we'll look at this in some of the ecological economics literature here in a second. There's ambitions for broader social mobility, but I think on some level, people are looking and seeking a more sustainable way of life. Right, so that's the pull dimension. The problem is amenity migration. That is, what are those factors that are pulling people in? Is actually not well understood. There's very poor empirical literature and observational research on this. We often infer positive amenities from the fact that people are leaving very high risk sending zones, and we'll use the vocabulary of sending zones and receiving zones, sending zones being areas of inordinately high measures of risk and cost associated with that, and they're ending up in places that we can call receiving zones. This is climate havens. We'll use the kind of clinically neutral language of receiving zones in full recognition that one can never escape climate. But in that sense, and of course it's not a pure binary in spatial terms, people live in between sending and receiving zones, and I think we can appreciate that. But that being said, every receiving zone tends to have a slightly different qualitative determination or set of preferences or a story behind it. So when we see people leaving very high risk areas and we track to where they're going, where they end up, these receiving zones are shaped by a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's affordability, sometimes it's economic opportunity, sometimes they just happen to have a sufficient housing stock from which people can access. Case in point, in California, for instance, in some markets, upwards of 20% of the rental market stock can be from people who are essentially being displaced either temporarily or permanently from forest fires. That's an enormous burden when you think about the overall housing limitations that we have today in the market. So as we begin to think about this climate and its influence on social mobility, or human mobility, I should say, we have to ask ourselves, well, who is on the move? And full acknowledgement that the move part of this is everything from local relocation all the way up to transcontinental climate migration, or climate migration, if you will, as a shortcut. So in this context, there's a variety of different cohorts. Now, the first cohort that we can think about are the episodically displaced. In involuntary terms, these are people who lose their home, they lose their job, whatever that may be. It's an episode, it's a particular shock, and they are displaced. So we can think of this really in displacement terms. On the other end of the continuum, in voluntary terms, we have a whole cohort of preemptive value investors. These are often wealthy people, individuals, trusts, and estates that are actually thinking about how can they profit and how can they think about building and investing capital in anticipation of where people are going, or in capturing that movement of people along the way. Now, the next category after episodically displaced are stress-based sorting agents. And stress-based sorting agents are essentially people who are making a trade-off. And the trade-off is they're willing to absorb some risk of loss in exchange for generally a lower cost of living. In that sense, they're going to say, all right, I'll pay a lower rent here, in full acknowledgement that I may have some uninsured or underinsured property losses along the way, often uninsured property losses along the way. This brings up a whole category of broader social vulnerability when we think about personal property disproportionately making up the composition of people's wealth, and the extent to which that's physically at risk in this situation. But people make trade-offs: flood zones, wildfire zones, storm surge zones, et cetera, et cetera. There's a tremendous amount of empirical research and how people sort and make these trade-offs. Next, we have circumstantial opportunists. And circumstantial opportunists are people who, when presented with climate risk information, they're agnostic otherwise to climate, but when presented with information, for instance, in a disclosure context, or perhaps even through a realtor or a friend, or searching on Zillow, if you will, as incomplete as that may be, they will make an election between two equal opportunities or two options to de-risk their consumption, right? They will choose between two equals, more or less, to de-risk. And finally, and this is a very, very important cohort of those who are on the move, we have the electively mobile. These are people who have the wealth, the resources, the job skills, and the capacity or capability, as it's called in migration studies, to be on the move. And they are actively thinking about where they can build a community, build wealth, and they very often are motivated by multi-generational wealth transfer in thinking about where they are going to move. So another question that comes up in this broader thesis that's memorialized in the book and in a body of scholarship across several disciplines. Well, how many people are we talking about in terms of people being on the move? Well, there's competing perspectives on this. Demographers are going to say, well, people follow fairly predictable life cycle patterns and mobility patterns. Most of the movement will be intralocal, and I generally take that position, moving from one part of town to the other. And they're entirely agnostic on inbound climate migration. So for instance, if we can think of Latin America or Central America and destabilization in an intra-political environmental violence context or whatever it may be, they're completely agnostic. They're really looking at a fairly endogenous orientation to it all. Among other social scientists who study this, they really struggle to incorporate adaptation, particularly household level adaptation. And of course, through the ingenuity of the course of human civilization, we've always adapted in some form or another. And if we didn't, well, that society didn't succeed to move forward. And so adaptations and that ingenuity and the novelty of it are very difficult to, let's say, quantify or model or project moving forward. Now, there is a bunch of work that's happening in agent-based modeling, and the agent-based modeling is offering some insight in terms of quantities and the movement of people, but the agent-based models are often based on preferences. And these preference surveys, or survey-based preferences, are very difficult to scale. They may apply in one region or in one context, but they're very difficult to apply more broadly. There is certainly advancement, but it's certainly not policy ready. Now, if you ask economists, probably the least interesting among the bunch, they will say that mobility is generally derived from wage differentials or the opportunity for economic advancement. If I can make more money on the move and I can support, of course, afford wherever I'm going to end up, then that will be fairly deterministic in their thinking and their theorization of mobility. Now, their economists have also looked at resource-based industries, and they said, sure, some resource-based industries will be on the move, but it will tend to sort of net itself out because other non-resource-based industries will follow back in on capital investments being left behind, otherwise in terms of stranded assets. So, how many people will be on the move? Nobody really knows. It's likely to be in the millions, really tens of the millions over the course of the balance of the century, as I think we can appreciate. Perhaps way too early to measure in many circumstances. My colleague Matthew Power has done tremendous work on this, has placed a certain range in the tens of millions over the balance of the century. But I think it's very important to remember that even small numbers, this is critical, at least in my Academy of the Built Environment, that even small numbers of people on the move, for instance, in Vermont, if you will, can have a huge outsized influence on where they end up. And this is something that I think represents, again, both an opportunity and a risk in terms of the underlying geography. Fun fact, about 1% of the population, at least in recent years, has been displaced by climate change, at least temporarily. And about 500,000 people a year in recent years have been permanently displaced by natural disasters. Of course, not all natural disasters have formal attribution to climate. We can tease that out empirically if you like. That's about 4 times the total amount of population on the move during the Dust Bowl from the 1930 to 1940. So, if we think about the cultural resonance of the Dust Bowl and how that plays out, certainly in terms of literature and our popular awareness, and yet somehow this seems to be going under the radar on some level. So, what about Sunbelt migration? Isn't everybody in America just moving to high-risk areas in the Mississippi coast and South Florida and the like? Well, to understand the Sunbelt, we have to understand the real reasoning and motivation for the growth of the Sunbelt. The Sunbelt did originate through preference. That is, people really did want to move to the sunshine. A lot of service personnel had been in the South during the war. They wanted to return there in the retirement in the 1960s with the advent of air conditioning. We see here MWTP, marginal willingness to pay. The underlying preferences did show pretty consistently that the Sunbelt grew for that very reason. People just wanted to leave the cold weather. By the way, in the 1970s, it was very cold here in the Northeast, very, very cold. We had some enormous blizzards. It didn't help along the way. But the real reason that the Sunbelt grew from the 1980s going forward, and this accelerates through time, and we'll see this sort of trend line here in a second, is because of cheap housing, cheap local property taxes. They put caps on taxes to taxable in the 1990s and the 2000s, which, by the way, you pay for today because you've underinvested in capital investment in your infrastructure. And now we see a failure of growth management driving up or driving down affordability. Cheap energy, often carbon-intensive coal-fired energy in the South, and low-wage non-union labor. And that relative opportunity for affordability or accessibility of affordable housing, all the relative low costs, particularly from a state and local sales tax or state and local property taxes or whatever SALT taxes you add up, that offered real opportunity. And of course, as an employer, you can just pay people less by moving to the Sunbelt. And that's exactly what happened over time. Now, what does the literature tell us today in terms of preference? Well, what the literature tells us pretty consistently is that there's actually an increased marginal willingness to pay for more moderate weather and more moderate temperatures. People really don't want hot and humid weather. And in fact, it has been decreasing. That preference has been shown to decrease for hot and humid weather. Interesting research, even looking at wind speeds for a while, believe it or not, because you can think about the physiological implications of cooling our body relative to wind speeds in certain environments. I think about Chicago, it'd be very cold, but for many other people, it's a good way to cool yourself down. Living in New Orleans at some point in time, I can tell you when the wind isn't blowing, it's much, much hotter. That being said, sunshine today has a waning and negative influence on domestic migration. This is pretty clear through a variety of bodies of research. So if the originating logic of the Sunbelt was that people are going to move here because it's cheap, there's many, many metrics that I think we can tease out that speak to a dwindling cost burdens or increasing cost burdens, dwindling affordability. So housing costs are going up, energy costs are going up, taxes are going up. It's a constraint and limitation of the underlying growth model of the Deep South and the Sunbelt more generally. So any advantages that might have had are rapidly dwindling. I mean, it's worth acknowledging just by context that, if you live in Arizona or even Georgia or Florida, you can easily spend, for instance, as a renter, you can easily spend a 2 times multiple on your power bill for running the air conditioning than your underlying rent, right? I mean, that's amazing if you think about that, and the energy cost burdens associated with that, just having air conditioning. So we can think about energy cost burden. We can think about, this is RCP 8.5, so take it with a grain of salt. This is a different map and a different landscape, certainly in a Trump era than when this map was produced. But you can begin to understand the spatial dimensions of the geography of risk moving forward. So some colleagues of mine a number of years ago at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco started to look at the relationship between movement of people and domestic migration. And here we're looking at an estimated slope coefficient. These are, you can think state to state. This is cool states and red states. It's not a perfect proxy because it's actually measuring extreme heat and extreme cold, but close enough. And what you see from the 70s going forward is actually people are moving towards, and a positive number there, towards warmer states. They're moving from cold states and they're moving to warmer states. We get that. I think that's the general narrative of the Sun Belt migration. Now with counties, that begins to shift a little bit, and there's some interesting data there. With rural counties, it's completely begun to move inversely. There's some interesting reasons why that may be, and I'm going to skip over that for now, because what I really want to show you, this is the movement of people in their 60s. And this looks quite similar to people in their 70s and quite similar to people in the 20s. And what is happening, and what's very clear now, is that people are moving and really leaving warm states, and they're moving to blue states. They're moving to cooler environments. Because even within a state like Arizona, people may actually be moving north, if you will, and at a higher elevation. So elevation, it's not just pure cardinal direction. Elevation plays a major factor here. But the bottom line is people are moving, and people in their 60s, 70s, and 20s show very consistent patterns in this regard. And we can theorize, and in fact, there's some research in even real estate marketing data, believe it or not, that sets up a consideration where people are they're sensitive to uninsurable risk of loss. They're on a budget. If you're going into your 60s and 70s, you're trying to get to retirement, or you are in retirement. You're trying to build a community. If you're in your 60s or 70s, this is where you're going to be living, or particularly in your 70s, this is where you're going to be living and retiring for some time. And if you're in your 20s, you're trying to build a family, you're trying to build a foundation for something in your life. They're showing very similar and complementary outcomes here as it relates to their geographic considerations for movement. Interestingly enough, this isn't in the book, this just came out a couple of weeks ago. There seems to be a reverse flow in domestic net migration. And in fact, since 2022, the amount of people moving in the United States to the Sun Belt has been cut in half in just 3 years. And for the first time in 70 years, there's actually been a positive net migration to the Midwest. These are very small numbers, but nonetheless, I think indicative of a broader trend in the United States. Funny enough, this guy Hamilton Lombard is a young demographer at the University of Virginia, sent me this note. He's the one that did this research that was recently published in The Economist, or covered in The Economist. And he told me in this email, my wife and I are moving to the Shenandoah Valley. Let me see exactly what he says here, because it's noticeably cooler, less humid, and has fewer mosquitoes than Charlottesville. So even the guy who's doing the underlying demography had the presence to send me this note, and I appreciated that. So north, as the book is titled, is really a gross oversimplification in terms of cardinal direction. Much of what we think about and have observed to date is relatively local in terms of its geographic context. But that being said, there is and there are transcontinental sending and receiving zones. We see places that are very clearly marked in both directions. So we can begin to organize push and pull in terms of the underlying influences and kind of north to south in geographic terms. And Miami, New Orleans, and Phoenix are clear enough in terms of being sending zones, but we also have places like Asheville, Charlottesville, Nashville, where there has been some observed preference for receiving zones. And of course, anytime I bring up Asheville, I like to flash this across the screen. I thought I could flash it faster, but it's a little slow. Asheville, no doubt, has long been observed, and I say long, at least in the past 10 years, has been a real receiving zone. Even a woman I was at Brown yesterday, she was just telling me how her parents moved from Fort Lauderdale, got tired of the insurance, and they live in Asheville. Everywhere I go, somehow this is a very consistent story. But the bottom line is that people said, oh, there's a big flood in Asheville and it's destroyed, it's wiped off the map. It's not really a climate haven. Well, we can fully acknowledge and all appreciate that there is no climate haven. This is a relative perception that people have in terms of the underlying range of risks. And if we know anything about post-disaster development in America, we can observe that Asheville will simply be rebuilt at a higher price point. They will come in and regrade the lots. They will put in the bells and whistles of engineering resilience as a luxury amenity. They will combine the units into planned unit development. They will have a floodable first floor that gets blown out in the event of the next and when the next flood happens. And they will sell it for 2 to 3 times the original property value. It's already happening. In fact, it had already been happening in the Arts District and some of the districts that were most heavily flooded in Asheville anyway. This is just the beginning, unfortunately, of what Asheville will be defined as in terms of being a sending or a receiving zone in America. Now, Asheville, of course, also brings up a very good point, and this is from our work in the National Climate Assessment. It can rain and, extreme precipitation is probably one of the most immediate and proximate physical risks that we face across the country. It can rain and flood just about anywhere at any given time, right? Nashville shows us that very squarely. So in my context, my original motivation for writing this book, or at least by virtue of titling the book, was thinking about range shifting and the broader understanding of what we've observed over many years now, at least in the northern hemisphere, flora and fauna moving slowly north, fisheries moving further out to sea in the north. So in the general sense of complex socioecological systems that we are a part of and interdependent within, why wouldn't humans also be part of this broader ecological range shifting? And so this is the live oak. This is work from the USDA a number of years ago. I think it's like RCP 4.5. This is the highest incidence of observation of the American blue jay. So we begin to see some of these quintessential features of the American landscape demonstrating their own range shifting. There had also been some work in human temperature niche and the extent to which as a species we've evolved, and there's a kind of temperature range from which we have a kind of optimization over the course of our own species. Of course, the distinguishing factor here would be, well, technology and institutions, and perhaps the adaptation of those institutions to these underlying changes of climate and ecology around us. So this brings us to a broader question, which is really a central ambition of the work, is really to take on a broader, let's say, scholarly ambition of the work, if you will, is to take on adaptation science. And, well, are we adapting? So in full acknowledgement that mobility and moving itself is a form of adaptation along the way. So climate migration, and there's a couple of different ways that I sort of parse this in the book, but if we think about climate migration, we think about human mobility, sure, there's the physical risk exposure and the push side of the equation that's shaping and is interacting rather with a lot of economic stresses and costs and devaluations and signals that may or may not be landing in the right places at the right time. But that's what I'll get to in a little while, is a clear signal that's actually having some effect. Well, the other part of the push factors that I explore in the book is that in a post-war period in America, we've spatially segregated ourselves by race and class. Right? I think we understand that. And one consequence of that, and this is a broad standing thesis for 30 years, is that we've spatially concentrated on homogenous belief systems. Economists like to say that like-minded agents like to live near like-minded agents. But that has adaptive and maladaptive implications. And adaptation, it drives down permits in high-risk areas. It drives adaptation policy and planning. If everybody's into it and they believe it, and as a community, you do seek action. But the downside in spatially concentrated areas of deniers, and you don't necessarily have to be a pure denier. I think some of you can appreciate the full spectrum of belief systems associated with climate. But if you don't think it's a risk or a proximate risk to you, or it's maybe disconnected from your life, whatever that may be, or you're in full denial through misinformation and the like, that's actually leading to severe maladaptive behaviors. And it's actually driving development in the wrong direction. It's taking on risks that aren't fully being absorbed as you would anticipate. There's also limited federal adaptation policy. This is probably the first publication that I can think of that very comprehensively takes on federal adaptation policy. But I also talk about the limitations of federal adaptation policy, one of which is that in constitutional terms, the federal government's just not out there to mediate the flow of capital and people by and between states. That's a kind of higher order proposition. On the ground, it's about politics. Adaptation's messy. There's winners and losers. There's trade-offs along the way. It's not as discrete as measuring decarbonization along the way and providing green jobs. It doesn't have the same narrative line. And for that reason, as I document in the book, the Biden administration wanted to have very little to do with adaptation. It just wasn't in their favor in terms of the way that they utilize electoral politics to drive policy, unfortunately, in the administration. So in returning to this, at the end of the day, and what I talk about at some length is, well, this really falls on the shoulders, at least as a matter of public policy and planning, on local governments. Right? This is a local consideration more broadly, and that's true in an economic sense or a public finance or public economic sense as well. So, but we have limited capacity in this country for these kinds of things. So brings us to a question. Are local governments adapting? Are they de-risking their tax base, their built environment, the housing stock? What are they doing? And the answer is mostly no. We have over 90,000 entities, governmental entities in the United States. Many of these are just local special purpose taxing entities. We only have, 500 adaptation plans that probably cover certainly less than 20%, probably around 10% of the US population. You can compare that with the Inflation Reduction Act, which poured billions of dollars into mitigation planning. About 80% of the US population is covered by a climate mitigation or decarbonization plan. So at the end of the day, only a few local governments have made strategic investments in adaptation along the way. We're going to remove hazard mitigation more formally and separate that from climate adaptation as well. But we're talking about New York, LA, San Francisco. Most places and much of the American population is simply not covered by some thinking along the way. And of course, one of the major challenges that we face, and we're already seeing this begin to manifest, is the climate doom loop, where taxes and cost of living go down, services go down, cost burdens go up, asset value go down, spending goes down, and public revenue goes down. This is a spoof on my colleague, Steen van Newberg from Columbia, the urban doom loop, which was instigated during COVID. And by the way, the urban doom loop was actually churning through in its processes during COVID. But guess what? The only reason we stopped it is because we spent hundreds of billions of US taxpayer dollars to stop that. And we're only weaning ourselves now off of the cash reserves that cities had accumulated from COVID for that very reason. This is not how one would think about proper public stewardship of debt in the long term. Now, and let's add in that context of fiscal stress. Let's think about this in the context of fiscal stress, where we have declining tax base and sending zones, if you will. What happens in these very high-risk areas, these sending zones, when we throw a disaster on top of it? That's just your normal sort of chronic complexity, chronic political challenges, but let's throw a disaster on there, and let's throw a disaster on top of this cake that we've made without FEMA or without adequate public aid. And not just FEMA, but HUD and a wide variety of post-disaster support that we have. Well, what do we know about federal post-disaster aid? It stabilizes a population, it stabilizes wages, it stabilizes housing values, and we've known pretty consistently, and I say we know, but the simulation-based research on this shows us that when you remove post-disaster aid, you're looking and staring down at significant bond defaults, right? We have $4.8 trillion in municipal bond debt in this country. And many, many jurisdictions are at a point where they could easily face a significant loss of revenue from just one disaster. And federal aid is the stopgap from preventing these bond defaults from moving forward. So what we can face, and what I would fully anticipate, and we're already seeing evidence of this, is future bond defaults within the bond market more formally. Interestingly enough, Chapter 9 bankruptcies for local governments are about reorganization of debt. They're actually not liquidation of debt. We really don't have a grasp, even legally, on how to handle the dissolution of local governments, many of whom simply are falling into the sea and do not have a rate base or a tax base to be fiscally solvent in the future. And what we already see now are receiverships where states and counties are coming in and absorbing lots of these local governments. By the way, this is a problem in Massachusetts because Massachusetts has lots of little tiny towns. It has no real county government delegations or county government to speak of, and they really just aren't able to operate at scale. Fun fact, Clyde, Texas was one of 12 bond defaults attributed formally to climate impacts in just the past couple of years. So the question is, well, are markets adapting? And the answer is mostly yes. A wide variety of research here, from rental housing to property taxes and mortgages, and various degrees of robustness along the way, various distributional effects or implications for households along the way. But what it sets up, particularly in the context of housing and insurance, municipal bonds and taxes and the like, is a kind of, well, Wall Street's adapting and the underlying institutions of the market economy are adapting. And that is leading to maladaptation by consumers. This is the kind of dominant rhetorical line. It's not necessarily true because in the long term, there may actually be long-term social welfare advances through the adaptation of Wall Street. But in the short term, there's going to be an enormous amount of pain, right? And I should qualify that statement and say that, obviously people are making money off of climate change, and that's going to be a lot of pain too. But in theory, the market economy could drive some positive behaviors and shape positive consumption behaviors in the long run. But the question is who gets churned in the middle along the way, and that is a question of inequality among many others. So I try to unpack insurance markets, and I try to make sense of real estate markets in this context, and I talk about mortgage markets, and I talk about blue lining, the proposition where financial institutions, the blue line came to me because I was sitting down with a banker one time in South Florida, and he's like, and we were looking over some maps and floods and climate maps and things like this. And he pulls out a blue marker and just draws around this area. He's like, we're just not lending here. We're not making mortgages in this area. It's just too risky. We don't want to have it on the books. We could probably sell it, but it's just not for us. So when we think about, well, the market economy is adapting and Wall Street's adapting, at least rhetorically on some level. How is this shaping our ability and capacity for public sector investment? Well, I love this quote from the Biden administration, the Council of Economic Advisors. The government action that targets, constrains market failures, impede adaptation, blah, 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 should be most effective in supporting enabling private action. This is key. Rather than crowding out actions that would have occurred otherwise or anyways. Translation, good luck, you're on your own. Right? The scale of our economy is such that no sector, no government institution has the fiscal capacity to take on anything that looks like fair or equitable distribution or even strategic adaptation. At best, what we can do is steer technologies and regulations. And again, this is a question of law and policy more fundamentally, but it's also a question of what it means to make public investments. And for those of you, if there's any economists in the group, I'd love to talk about negative discount rates, and because that's a fun conversation to have. But what does it really mean? And what does it mean to have return on that investment, which is we kind of net present value optimized our investments as a government. What does it mean to throw money away in the interest of advancing people's lives? Right? So there's deeper questions here. And actually, this speaks to a deeper critique of the kind of neoliberal orientation of the Democratic Party to rely on these market functions in a way that ignore the economic populism that's been a groundswell in this country. I think we need to be pretty honest with ourselves about that. So nowhere do we see this. And I think this is a fun conversation to have, particularly in Massachusetts, where you pay a lot of property taxes. And I'd love to talk about property tax caps in Massachusetts because I have a whole presentation on that, is on bonds. So in the bond market, the more risk you have, the more it's charging, right? They're charging, your interest carry is going up. These are relatively marginal costs. It's driven by credit rating agencies. Even the MBTA, when they go out to borrow money, the credit rating agencies show up and they say, what are you doing about climate? We know that your revenue is going to drop if the red line gets flooded here or there. And what are you going to do about it along the way? These have costs. And these are considered material risks in the security world. And the question is, well, what are they really afraid of? What are bond investors really afraid of? What they're afraid of is that you're not going to have revenue to pay back your debt, particularly on a 10 or 30, 10-year call, 30-year bond term. Interestingly enough, this is from Linda Shine and some colleagues. Just a moderate amount of sea level rise in Florida on the coast would wipe out what is it, 30% of local revenue in 410 municipalities in Florida. I mean, this is the difference between paying your teachers and not, right? These are significant numbers. And by the way, this plays out in Cape Cod, it plays out in Cape Ann, it plays out right here in your backyard in ways you may not appreciate it. Interestingly enough, the longer the maturity of the debt, the higher the risk premium that the marketplace is demanding, right? If they've got to sit on this for 20 years, they want to be compensated because why? Climate's accelerating its intensity and underlying impact, or at least that's the assumption. I remember sitting down a number of years ago on Wall Street and talking with a banker who was actually what a banker is bond buyer who indexed about 30 or 40% of the market on any given day. I think about 30 or 40 billion. How many? Was it? It's like 30 or 40 billion dollars a day or something is flowing through the market and being indexed. And he had a Key West Aqueduct Authority bond that came across, looked at the documents, just had a sense that that seemed kind of risky to invest in a water system in Key West. If you've all ever been to Key West, he literally went to the NOAA sea level rise viewer. Some of you have probably been there yourself. Put in about 6 feet, 3 feet, and said, you know what, I'm passing on this bond. By passing on that bond, being about 30% of the market, that had consequences ultimately for the interest yield where that bond landed and who was actually paying for that, believe it or not. The good news is when you do something about it, you make investments in adaptation, and the bond market is viewing a kind of more robust adaptive capacity, you're getting credit for that. So it's actually, there's some benefit ultimately in terms of cost burden by making these investments. So it's estimated about 10% of the municipal bond is subject to pretty significant material risks to climate change. We've seen a whole slew of disclosures over time, and there's great research and correlations between risk and borrowing costs associated with floods, coastal hazards, wildfires, and even some emerging evidence on droughts. So where we land is the climate intelligence arms race, and a recognition that the private sector is using proprietary science and technology, some good, some valid, some not so good, but they're utilizing it as a kind of information asymmetry to make money on climate change, right? I can short bonds when a mortgage hits. I can short a supply chain for gases necessary for HVAC systems. There are people who make money on climate change, and they're utilizing a certain proprietary set, and we can think of this aggregation and investment in R&D as a kind of climate intelligence arms race. So why do I bring this up? Because I think we tend to think that through democratic processes and democratic institutions that we can make determinations about who gets forward and who gets left behind, right? I think we believe that, and I believe that with some measure of optimism myself. And the reality is some people will no doubt benefit from public investment in terms of in situ adaptation, if you will. But for all those that are dislocated by climate change in direct terms, there will be many others who will be forced at the hand of the market. And we already see this, not just in terms of physical displacement, but the shaping of our options, our values, and the pathways from which social mobility in the context of climate change is rewriting American geography. So this geography of risk still sticks in my mind in terms of the geography. This is the work of Eric Tate at Princeton. This is the convergence of high social vulnerability and high flood zone risk. You can see the distribution here. This is mortality. Again, RCP 8.5, take it with a grain of salt. I probably could have just used a different RCP and adjusted contrast in the model now that I think about it. Economic damages, weighted heavily by the value of human life. And of course, I return to this underlying sort of spatial sense of the optimization or the niche of our species along the way. So this isn't my work. This is the work of the Place Initiative. People, planners, architects, social scientists, physical scientists, they're trying to think about, okay, well, we recognize there's all these high-risk geographies. We see the geography of risk. Where are people going, right? What does this really fundamentally look like in terms of where people are heading? And they've kind of outlined this emergent geography. Many of these places are already well-observed receiving zones, including a place called Ocala, Florida, which is the third fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States. It's actually larger than Tallahassee, the state capital. Just in the past couple of years, just few years, they've permitted 50,000 housing units and 85,000 home lots. In a country where we barely had 1 million homes produced and sold in a transactional context, this is an enormous amount of housing production. People are moving off the coast of Florida if that isn't abundantly clear. They're moving off in very large numbers. And there's a lot of data. people don't just wake up and say, oh, it's climate change, and packing the car and I'm moving. Although if you read the first introduction in my book, that actually did happen to us. It was a hurricane, and my wife was pregnant, so we did have to get out. But what happened is it's interacting with a lot of different things. Climate is no doubt a consideration, and we see this showing up again in a lot of different data points. Ocala is in Gainesville, Florida, by the way. I was there the other day. The same thing is happening. It's bidding up housing costs. It's an extra few kids in your kid's classroom. It's an extra 10 minutes to the grocery store. That growth, they can feel it and they can see it along the way. So climate havens are no doubt a creation of the media, and I think we can understand the limitations of that rhetorically. Nowhere is safe. I think we understand that. You have to think about pairing the economic development behind some of that rhetoric with planning and thinking about sustainable urban development. In fact, those communities like Milwaukee, for instance, or Buffalo that have projected themselves as these kind of climate havens. Of course, they're not, but they're really actually not trying to get people to move there. They're actually trying to develop a local and mobilize a local population to understand the benefits of having new neighbors, the benefits of investing in sustainability and the like. And I love this quote because I think it's an important quote to keep us honest from an environmental justice advocate in Michigan. A lot of disparities, people, yada, yada, yada. It's a climate haven for those that can afford it, right? So we have to give consideration to the crowding out, the climate gentrification, if you will, of what happens when people move in. And we see this all across the board throughout the United States. So I think in recognition of the opportunity for sustainable investment in our communities and receiving zones, we have to be very careful. If we leave this up in a kind of disorderly private ordering of it, if you will, we're just going to perpetuate suburban sprawl, right? We can see what's happening in Vermont and the extreme environmental degradation of Vermont with an unplanned movement of people along the way. And so I think on some level there's a rationality here, and that's reflected in the empirical research in the book and from kind of purely economic point of view, but we also have to acknowledge the affective reasoning, the emotional connection to place, and also the fictions that we create for ourselves and what it means to build a life somewhere else. So I've tried to, in this book, not only dispel the perils of climate havens, the myth behind it, but also understand why has this been part of our public discourse. And I think the reason it's been part of our public discourse is because people are desperate for optimism. They want to have some control, right? They want to have some control in what seems like a world that's otherwise out of control. So for me, this is a huge opportunity to advance parallel social goals along the way. My own work in Duluth has gained some notoriety through various documentaries over the years, but what we were really trying to show, not that Duluth was some great climate haven, we were trying to show that if you had people move there, you could capture that capital, capture that population, and advance an investment in the community and in mass transit and things like that. So I think what we need, we have the tools, the technology, the institutions, we have everything we need. What we need is a vision for what receiving zones could or should look like. So what if renewable energy or transmission of renewable energy started to spatially co-align with receiving zones? What would that look like from a jobs and labor opportunity, from an economic opportunity? What could this new geography really be, and what could it look like? Because listen, we all want to have socially inclusive, mixed income, infill planned communities, right? This is the language and the lingo of a kind of normative projection of the built environment that we've taken on for many, many years. But we have to be super critical of that, because where we're heading, as it stands now, is exclusive enclaves of high performance private governance and private infrastructure. Babcock ranches in Florida, right? People moving off the coast, and they are organizing themselves and perpetuating degrees of spatial inequality, and they're taking on their own private infrastructure, their own forms of private governance, and that has significant costs in terms of the collective ambition to invest in our future. And by the way, if we get this wrong, displacement camps are what we face, right? And if you think, oh, there's no displacement camps, there's measures of informality, that doesn't exist in America. It does. And there's children who grew up after Hurricane Andrew, after Hurricane Katrina, spent their entire lives through high school in more or less a displacement camp, living in a FEMA trailer. So last chapter of the book is a work of fiction. It's America in 2079. I use a number of different devices, including the climate credit score, a form of social credit. What if on the Cartesian plane of rights and responsibilities, we went all in on responsibilities? So an extra few miles driving in our car or everything we do is tracked in terms of carbon consumption. We're penalized for it along the way. How do we begin to relate to each other? How do we think about our environment differently? What happens if we begin to perpetuate the current trends that we see in terms of the privatization of infrastructure and governance? What happens as a result of our own political reorganization? Spoiler alert, there's essentially a civil conflict in Florida based on a massive hurricane that brings down the fiscal capacity of the state. They have to liquidate assets. People get very upset about an income tax. And the state of Florida splits into two states, the state of North Florida and the state of South Florida. So there's some fun reading for the Floridians in the bunch along the way. So it's a world of both scarcity and abundance. And I think in that context, we've built islands for ourselves, and it's very easy to romanticize the islands of isolation that we've built for ourselves. But the reality is we need an escape plan, but we really need an adaptation plan. We need to think more formally and strategically about how we prepare and respond to the impacts of climate change at every level, because we live in a certain measure of precarity, and housing and mortgages and insurance and all that's probably clear enough at this point, because the markets are adapting. They're moving very fast, and they're moving much faster than our public institutions can keep up with. So yes, there's social change. Yes, people are changing. They're thinking about price signals, and they're changing their consumption patterns, and that offers a great amount of promise. But there's an enormous peril for those that are immobile along the way, and that's what we have to give some significant recognition to. So this is the new geography of risk and opportunity that I see, and for me, this isn't opportunistic. This is a measure of optimism about our path forward, because we really have no other choice. So thank you very much for having me.